Good evening. I'm thankful to be able to be here tonight and to worship with you all. I'm thankful you all made the choice to come out here tonight and to worship together with us and praise our God together. It's a very blessed thing that we have. I see some faces that I didn't get to see this last week because they were sick, and I'm very grateful that you're recovering and feeling better and are able to be with us tonight. Now, when we're looking for a person to fulfill a certain role or job, we have some expectations that we want from them, that we want to see from them to fulfill that job and to reach our desires. And that process can range from complicated things like picking someone for the right job, or to all the way just deciding who you want to be friends with and keep close. Like when you're looking for someone to uh, keep as a friend around, as a close friend, there might be some things you want to see in that, like someone who shares interests with you, that you can do things together that you both like, or maybe someone who's good at conversations and listening, that you could spend time talking with them and feel heard by them. When looking for those things, you're like, that's the kind of person I want to spend time around and be with. Or picture that you're at your job and you're tasked with hiring someone to fulfill a new role. And you're given all these resumes to look through and find the person fit for the job, someone to hire. You're probably looking for someone with an experience in that position, someone who's had a history of success. These are the kind of people that in the world we expect to fulfill that job and fulfill that role. But the problem with just that approach is that it's very surface level. You're looking at what you want to see in that person and the surface level things, but you're not looking any deeper, looking at the character of that person. So sure, you have someone around that you could hang out with and enjoy things together, but they kind of treat you poorly and they lie to you a lot and they ditch out on some of your hangouts, and that's not a very good friend. Or you hire this person to do this job and you're like, this is the right person for the job. He meets all the qualifications, and then he shows up to work and he gets the job done, but he treats his coworkers very poorly. He doesn't like them at all, and it just brings down the morale of the entire group. We need to look deeper at the character of our person, not just the surface. The Israelites made the mistake of looking just at the surface when choosing who they wanted to have as a ruler. Now, the Israelites had a ruler at the time. They had Samuel, a prophet and a judge that God put in place. Like, this is who will guide you and rule over you. He put in place someone who would teach the people about God and lead them the right way, so that the people would be successful and prosperous in the land and faithful to God. But the people grew tired of that. Their ears grew dull of God's teaching, and they're like, we don't want your ruler anymore, God. What we want is a king like the rest of the world, a king like the worldly kings, someone who matches their expectations of who a king should be, not God's. And so instead of really directly punishing them for this, God's like, fine, I'll give you your kind of king, what you want from a king. That being someone who is strong, who is above average for the people around them in terms of height and strength and knowledge, someone who can fit the standard role of king in the world. But they didn't look at his character at all. God gave them this king Saul to match the worldly expectations of a king, but Saul's character did not match the character God wanted in a king. So Saul started out strong. He started out as a decent king, but he quickly fell away. He quickly stopped obeying God, not always fulfilling all that God said, and then eventually reached the point where he became a murderer and he was killing God's priests and chasing down God's anointed and prophets and things like that. He quickly turned far from God. Because of that, God rejects him. He's like, you are no longer the king of Israel. I'm going to look for a new king, the one that I want as king, not that the people want. And that's where our scripture reading earlier comes from. We have in 1 Samuel 16, Samuel, who was the judge and prophet of Israel, is sent to anoint the new king. He's sent to this a family of Jesse who has several sons, and all of his sons are brought before Samuel. And Samuel looks at the firstborn, Eliab. He's a big, strong guy, very attractive, and we'll later find out that he was a man of war, someone who fought in battles. Samuel looks at him and he's like, this has to be the king. This has to be who God was talking about. This fits the image. And God's like, no. I want to read God's words to Samuel after Samuel talks about this. And in verse 7, God says to Samuel, "Do not look at his appearance or his stature, because I have rejected him. Humans do not see what the Lord sees, for humans see what is visible, but the Lord sees the heart." That Samuel was just looking at the surface, which, as we talked about, is not the right way to look at people like this. God says that he doesn't look at that, but he looks at is the heart, the character of that person, who that person is. And that'll determine the right person for the job, to be king over Israel. And so they get through all of Jesse's sons, and the one to be king isn't there. That's because the one that God chose to be king was the youngest son of Jesse, the one no one expected to be king. He was still a youth, and he was out shepherding his father's flock, shepherding being the lowest of low jobs to do, and that's why it was given to the youngest kid. He wasn't even brought because there was no expectation for him to be king, but God chose him. He chose David to be king over Israel. That's because God looked at his heart, his character, who David was as a person, and his heart was the one that God wanted, the one that would be able to rule the people as God wanted him to be able to teach the people and guide the people. David had a character that stood out to God. Now, we don't get a real picture in chapter 16 of the character of David, but over in the next chapter, chapter 17, where we will be spending the rest of our time this evening, we get a first glimpse at David and his character and his heart that God saw. Now, there's so much to the character of David that we could talk about. There are multiple books, the books of Samuel and Chronicles, that have a lot to say about who David was. David wrote a lot of Psalms that give us a picture of his heart and his thinking. And so there's a lot of things about David's character that we should take note of and think about and replicate in our own lives. But this evening, I want to focus on three aspects of David's character that we read in chapter 17. One of the most well-known, most referred to passages in the Bible, which is the story of David versus Goliath, what has been summarized down to mostly the underdog beating this big, strong giant that no one would be able to defeat. And it's used in so many ways, referred to in so many ways, as talking about like an underdog football team beating the undefeated champions of that season, or a military that was not seen in any way of winning a battle, but they pull through somehow by their own wit and strength. But that's not really what we have here in the story of David and Goliath. What we have are these three things, three aspects of David's character that stand out. That David is a man of courage and he stands up for what is right. That David puts his trust not in the worldly things, not in what the world sees, but David trusts in the Lord. And the last thing we'll talk about is that David has the humility to give credit to where credit is due. So let's just start reading the story and get an idea of what we're talking about. 1 Samuel 17, I'm going to start reading in verse 1. We get some context here. 1 Samuel 17 and verse 1. The Philistines gathered their forces for war at Socoh in Judah, and camped between Socoh and Azekah in Ephes Dammim. Saul and the men of Israel gathered and camped in the valley of Elah. Then they lined up in battle formation to face the Philistines. The Philistines were standing on one hill, and the Israelites were standing on another hill, with a ravine between them. Then a champion named Goliath from Gath came out from the Philistine camp. He was 9 feet 9 inches tall and wore a bronze helmet, bronze scale armor that weighed 125 pounds. There were there was bronze armor on his shins, and a bronze javelin was slung between his shoulders. His spear shaft was like a weaver's beam, and the iron point of his spear weighed 15 pounds. In addition, a shield bearer was walking in front of him. He stood and shouted to the Israelite battle formation. Why do you come out to line up in battle formation? He asked them. Am I not a Philistine and you are not servants of Saul? Choose one of your men and have him come down against me. If he wins in a fight against me and kills me, we will be your servants. But if I win against him and kill him, then you will be our servants and serve us. Then the Philistine said, I defy the ranks of Israel today. Send me a man so we can fight each other. When Saul and all Israel heard these words from the Philistine, they lost their courage and were terrified. Now David was the son of the Ephraite from Bethlehem of Judah, named Jesse. Jesse had 8 sons, and during Saul's reign was already an old man. Jesse's 3 oldest sons had followed Saul to the war, and their names were Eliab the firstborn, Abinadab the next, and Shammah the third. And David was the youngest. The 3 oldest had followed Saul, but David kept going back and forth from Saul to tend to his father's flock in Bethlehem. Every morning and evening for 40 days, the Philistine came forward and took his stand. One day, Jesse had told his son David, take this half bushel of roasted grain, along with these 10 loaves of bread for your brothers, and hurry to their camp. Also, take these 10 portions of cheese to the field commander. Check on the well being of your brothers and bring a confirmation from them. They are with Saul and all the men of Israel in the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistines. So David got up early in the morning, left the flock with someone to keep it, loaded up, and set out as Jesse charged him. He arrived at the perimeter of the camp as the army was marching out in its battle formation, shouting their battle cry. Israel and the Philistines lined up in battle formation, facing each other. David left his supplies in the care of the quartermaster and ran to the battle line. When he arrived, he asked his brothers how they were. While he was speaking with them, suddenly the champion named Goliath, the Philistine from Gath, came forward from the Philistine battle line and shouted his usual words, which David heard. When all the Israelite men saw Goliath, they retreated from him, terrified. So what's going on here is that Israel and Philistia are at war with each other. They've been at war for most of their history. And they come up to a battle, lined up for a normal battle. But then this man steps forward from the Philistine line, Goliath, towering over everyone else, stronger than everyone else. And he meets them with this challenge that you have a whole army against me, and that doesn't seem quite fair. So send out a champion to fight me one on one. And the stakes are pretty high. If the Israelites champion wins, then the Philistines would surrender and be their servants. But if Goliath, the giant, the warrior, won the one on one battle, then Israel would have to surrender and be the servants of Philistia. And this challenge left all of Israel terrified and fleeing. And understandably so, if you're looking at it from a completely worldly perspective. The Israelite people were not the tallest around, they were not the strongest. And so looking at someone like Goliath, who towers over everyone and whose skill is greater than anyone's around them, no one would want to fight that. No one was willing to fight that. And for 40 days, and Goliath went out with this challenge, and no one would respond to them. They were all too afraid to do anything. Even Saul, the king the people wanted to fight for them, this king was terrified of Goliath and would not act. That is the fear that is stricken in them. But then David comes on the scene, and he's not there to fight. He is not a soldier. He's still shepherding. He's still too young to fight. But his 3 oldest brothers are out there as soldiers. So he's sent to go check in on them, bring some supplies. And David hears Goliath shouting his claims, mocking God and his people. But David responds differently from the people. He doesn't respond in terror. Let's see how David responds to hearing the words of Goliath. Picking up in verse 25 of 1 Samuel 17. Previously, an Israelite man had declared, do you see this man who keeps coming out? He comes to defy Israel. The king will make the man who kills him very rich and will give him his daughter. The king will also make the family of the man's father exempt from paying taxes in Israel. David spoke to the men who were standing with him. What will be done for the man who kills that Philistine and removes his disgrace from Israel? Just who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? The troops told him about the offer, concluding, that is what will be done for the man who kills him. David's oldest brother, Eliab, listened as he spoke to the men, and he became angry with him. Why did you come here? He asked. Who did you leave those few sheep with in the wilderness? I know your arrogance and your evil heart. You came down to see the battle. What have I done now? Protested David. It was just a question. Then he turned from these beside him to others in front of him and asked about the offer. The people gave the same answer as before. What David said was overheard and reported to Saul, so he had David brought to him. David said to Saul, don't let anyone be discouraged by him. Your servant will go and fight this Philistine. So when everyone else in the Israelite army is shaking with terror, these people who are trained for war, who are prepared for this battle, these people who are unwilling to fight because they are afraid of the enemy in front of them, this David, the person who is not trained in any way to fight, who is not a soldier, he is not strong in any way. It's just a kid, a shepherd kid. He has the courage to stand up to Goliath. And that kind of courage is very difficult to have when everyone around you is discouraged and terrified. Even his own king, the king of the land that should lead them, he is terrified. His own brother, Eliab, the oldest, rebukes David. He looks at David, he's like, what are you doing here? Aren't you supposed to be back with the sheep? I know that you're here for evil reasons, to just see the battle. Basically accusing him of skipping out on work to come see the battle. We know why David was there. He was there to help his brothers and check in on them. But his brother Eliab, who has been terrified and not fighting, accuses David of something evil when David was trying to do good and encourage the people around him. When everyone was looking at Goliath thinking, there's no way we could fight this guy, David says, who is this uncircumcised Philistine opposing us? Who is he to the armies of God? David didn't look up in fear, but he looked down because he had the courage to stand up to Goliath. And we see this contrast then between Eliab and David. That Eliab, who Samuel, when he first looked at him, thought, this must be the king. Eliab portrays a character that is not kingly, not good. He is evil in heart and is trying to tear down his brother David. But despite this, David perseveres through all of the discouragement he faces around him and chooses to take up courage when no one else would. And he stands up and offers to fight in the battle for the fate of all the people. And this is a great example of courage, but how can David stand here and have that kind of courage? David, who has no experience in fighting, is standing up ready to take on this great champion. Why is he able to have that kind of courage? Well, that kind of courage comes from the second point I want to talk about is that David put his trust not in the things of the world, but he put his trust in God. And we see that as we continue reading in the story. Picking up in, sorry, missed my spot. Picking up in verse 33. But Saul replied, you can't go fight this Philistine. You're just a youth, and he has been a warrior since he was young. David answers Saul, your servant has been tending his father's sheep. Whenever a lion or a bear came and carried off a lamb from the flock, I went after it and struck it down and rescued the lamb from its mouth. If it reared up against me, I would grab it by its fur, strike it down, and kill it. Your servant has killed lions and bears. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. Then David said, the Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. So Saul said to David, go, and may the Lord be with you. Then Saul had put his own military clothes on David. He put a bronze helmet on David's head and had him put on armor. David strapped his sword on over the military clothes and tried to walk, but he was not used to them. I can't walk in these, David said to Saul. I'm not used to them. So David took them off. Instead, he took his staff, and in his hand he chose 5 smooth stones from the wadi and put them in the pouch in his shepherd's bag. Then, with his sling in his hand, he approached the Philistine. So David goes up to Saul and he says, I will volunteer to fight this giant, this champion of Philistia. And Saul stops and he's like, you can't do that. You're just a kid. You're not even a soldier. You have no experience fighting. And this is a guy who has been training probably as long as you've been alive. You don't stand a chance against him. Saul was looking just at the surface. He was putting trust in worldly expectations of a champion, that being someone who is strong and capable and well trained and able to fight. But David doesn't meet that expectation. He is a kid, basically, untrained to fight, not a soldier, but just some shepherd boy coming in and to see what's going on. But David tells Saul this in response, that in his times being a shepherd, there were lions and bears that would come up, and they would act as predators do and take one of the sheep. And where most shepherds would probably just let that sheep go, David goes and hunts down this predator, these lions and these bears, and he strikes them down basically with his bare hands. That this untrained soldier, untrained non-soldier really, this shepherd, goes out and performs an act that no man can really do. I don't know about you, but I don't think I could go out and kill a bear or a lion with basically my own 2 bare hands. I've seen bears and lions from far off while hiking or something, and they're huge and they're terrifying and they're much stronger than any normal person. But David kills a bear and a lion by his own 2 hands on his own. And how does he say he does this? It's not by his own skill or strength. But what David says is because God delivered him from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear. That where David should have died because he stood no chance in this situation, he trusted in God and he was delivered from a situation that would have been hopeless. And he says, this Philistine, this champion, is in no way different from that bear or that lion, that God will deliver me just the same as then. He put his trust in God, who had shown David that he can trust in him. And we see that trust that David shows. And especially after that Saul agrees to let David go out there, Saul tries to give him all these weapons of war. He puts armor on him. He gives him the sword to send him out. But David, as we talked about, he's no soldier. He's never used armor or a sword like this. He says, I can't do this. I don't know how to use this stuff. And so he casts that aside. What the world would expect someone to go out with, what they would put their trust in to get them through a battle, their armor to defend them, and their weapons to slay their foes. David puts that aside. He's like, I'm not going to use this. Rather, he grabs a shepherd's staff and a few stones for his sling and goes out to fight Goliath like that. And in no way would you expect anyone to go into a battle like that and win, because that's not what we expect a champion of a nation to look like. But David did this because he didn't trust in those things. He put his trust in God and that what he had would be enough. So let's see how Goliath responds to seeing David, the champion, like this. Continuing in verse 41, it reads, the Philistine came closer and closer to David with the shield bearer in front of him. When the Philistine looked and saw David, he despised him because he was just a youth, healthy and handsome. He said to David, am I a dog that you come against me with sticks? Then he cursed David by his gods. Come here, the Philistine said to David, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts. David said to the Philistine, you come against me with a sword, spear, and javelin. But I come against you in the name of the Lord of armies, the God of the ranks of Israel. You have defied him. Today the Lord will hand you over to me. Today I'll strike you down, remove your head, and give the corpses of the Philistine camps to the birds of the sky and the wild creatures of the earth. Then all the world will know that Israel has a God, and this whole assembly will know that he is not by sword or spear the Lord saves. For the battle is the Lord's, he will hand you over to us. David goes out with little ways to fight Goliath, but fully confident, fully courageous, as we looked at, to stand up against him and confidently say to the champion that he will defeat him and that he will be victorious. And it's because he put his trust in God. That is how David could stand so courageously, where everyone else put their trust in worldly things and only looked at the surface, and that's why they were so afraid. David looked past that, put that aside, and put his trust in God, who can deliver, as David saw. And because of that, he could have courage. And in all of this, in all of David's courage and trusting in God, we see the last point that I want to talk about that really ties it all together, and that David is a man of humility, and where he gives credit where credit is due. Now, when David is first hearing about the challenge that Goliath is offering to the people, he goes around talking to a few of the soldiers to find out what is being offered for the one who defeats Goliath, because the king is giving out an incentive to try and encourage anyone to really stand up and fight Goliath. And that being that they'll be able to marry into the king's family, and the family of the victor will never have to pay taxes again. It's a very, very appealing offer from the king that would increase your status greatly. You would be glorified among everyone around you. It's a very appealing thing, but no one takes the offer up because they're too afraid of Goliath. But David volunteers to fight Goliath. And what is his motivation? His motivation isn't to increase his own glory. It's not to raise his family status and never have to pay taxes again. But David's motivation to go out and fight is because Goliath defied the Lord and the army of God. He mocked God's people and the Lord, and David would not let that stand. The people were cowering, but David's like, who is this uncircumcised Philistine standing before you, mocking God? David saw that the right thing to do was to go out and fight for God. And what we see is that when David is victorious, when David stands confidently before the Philistine, he doesn't take credit for his victory. When he's talking to Goliath, he doesn't say that it is going to be by his hand alone that he's going to defeat him, by his own skill as a soldier. But what David says is that the battle belongs to the Lord. It's a song that we have, and it comes from this, that God is in control of the battle, that he is the one who will deliver the Philistine. He is the one that will bring about David's victory. It's not by his own skill or merit. And we see David then, as you probably all know, strike down Goliath in a very quick and miraculous way, where he just takes one stone and lobs it at Goliath's forehead, killing him instantly. And he cuts off Goliath's head with Goliath's own sword. It is a victory that really no person could do on their own. And David recognizes that it is God who does this. David didn't go out there to fight for himself, for his own glory, but David went out to fight, to stand up for God and oppose those who defied and mocked God. David didn't take credit for his victory, but he saw that it was God who was victorious. And it was not really David. David was just the weapon that God was using, basically. And so when we're reading the story of Goliath, we got to get the picture right. The world talks about it a lot as an underdog standing up to the big guy and winning by his own strength when no one else saw it coming. But really, Goliath is the small person in this picture because he is trying to oppose the God of everything, the creator of all, the God of Israel. And when comparing Goliath to God, the creator of everything, Goliath is much, much smaller. He is no giant to God. And that's why he is struck down so quickly. So we need to consider these three characteristics of David. His humility to entrust the battle to God, seeing that he can't do it himself, but God can deliver, and to put his trust in that, and to take up courage that once he realizes that it is God who is victorious and he trusts in God's ability to deliver, he could stand up courageously to take on that battle. You might be thinking, how does this apply to us? Because there's not giants around that are threatening to kill us all. But metaphorically, we face our own Goliaths in many ways today. That we face obstacles and challenges in this world that in no way can we handle on our own. Whether it's the challenges of the world, losing your job maybe, or your house, your, a fire could come through any year and wipe out a whole neighborhood. And how does a person handle that on their own? It's not possible. But David shows us how we handle situations like this. Maybe we're dealing with temptation and sin, and we're trying over and over to deal with it on our own, but we keep falling short because we cannot handle it on our own. We need to act as David did, to humbly say that I can't deal with this on our own. Give that battle to God, trust in Him to deliver, and that way we could stand up to these obstacles in our path courageously. And keep in mind, we're able to do all this knowing that God has already slain the biggest giant in our life, conquered our greatest foe, and that being sin and death. That when He came down and took on flesh and died on a cross for us, He defeated sin, the opponent we had no chance of defeating. That same God wants us to put our trust in Him where we can't stand. He wants to help us and strengthen us. He just wants us to put our trust in Him, to stand up courageously, knowing that the God who delivered us from sin can deliver us still today. And that is what I want us to think about through this week with whatever challenges you're facing or you may face through this week. Keep in mind David and the character that he displayed here, and try and emulate that character in your own life to live as David did. Or think about like the song that we sung right before I came up here, Dare to Stand Like Joshua. That passage coming from when Joshua is speaking to the people and basically saying, even if none of you choose to follow God, I will follow God. Stand up for God and trust in Him because He can defeat the giants ahead of you. Now, if you're sitting there and you've been dealing with things on your own, you've been trying to get through the trials and struggles of life, doing it your own way, the worldly way, and you realize that it's futile, it's vain, and you want to experience what God is offering. You can be baptized and have your sins forgiven and start that life with Him. Join the side of God. Or maybe you've been struggling as a Christian and you've been facing struggles and you've been having a difficult time. You have your brothers and sisters in Christ here who want to help you with whatever it is that we can. If there's anything we can do for you tonight, please let us know now as we stand and sing this invitation song.